Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of The Overtime. We were in 2 Kings chapter 10, and there are several things that I want to do a little deeper dive in, but also some fascinating studies and patterns and things we can learn about God from 2 Kings chapter 10 that I think will help you in your everyday life. Our big idea today is serving God for your own glory leads to loss, but serving God for His glory leads to victory. And one of the things that we talked about is that it is entirely possible for you to do the right things for the wrong reasons. And if you do the right things for the wrong reasons, eventually you're going to burn out and it's going to lead to loss. But if you do the right things for the right reasons, you will find peace and you will find the blessing of God. One of the most fascinating characters in all of Scripture, and since we're leading into Easter week next weekend, I want to talk to you about Judas, because I think Judas is the poster child of doing the right things for the wrong reasons. Judas was handpicked by Jesus to be one of the 12, but there were some happenings and some disagreements and some small little hints that we see throughout the Scriptures that show us that, yes, Judas was there following Jesus, but he was following Jesus and doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. Here's a few clues. Judas, along with many others we know, believed that Jesus was going to come in and lead a revolution and overthrow the Roman government. Well, we find out that that wasn't why Jesus had intended to come, and we could see that there became a little bit of a tension and a lack of interest and buy-in from Judas the more he began to realize that. Judas was also placed in charge of the money bag, and he becomes a little bit opinionated about some of the decisions that Jesus makes with the money. For example, when the woman broke open the alabaster jar and anointed Jesus's feet, Judas was incredibly judgmental of the decision that she had made. This was the equivalent of a year's salary, and she lavished her love on Jesus. And Judas said, that money should have been given to the poor. And Jesus said, you will not always have me. And she chose the greater opportunity. Judas was self-righteous about the money. But then at the end, we see how Judas ultimately betrays Jesus for only 30 pieces of silver. So a couple other things that we see is, as far as closeness in Scripture, in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see that Judas is always listed last as far as closeness to Jesus. So just very subtle, but a small hint. But then the last clue that we see actually happens as the disciples are gathered, and Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be betrayed by one of you. All the disciples are freaking out. They're like, what do you mean? Is it me, Lord? Is it me, Lord? And they all say, is it me, Lord? Except for Judas. Judas does not say, is it me, Lord? He says, is it me, Rabbi? There's a difference. Is it me, almighty boss of my life, or is it me, teacher? You can see the difference. Judas did not view Jesus as Lord, but he respected him some as a person. So for the bulk of 3 years, Judas was actually one of these. He did the right things for the wrong motives. Another thing I want to do is I want to do a little deeper dive in 2 Kings. When the rest of Ahaziah, the king of Judah, the rest of his family was put to death. We didn't have time to cover this, but I thought that this was a really interesting quote. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 12. It says this, then he, that's Jehu, who's the king, set out and went to Samaria, the capital of Israel. Now, we remember that God had charged Jehu to eliminate all of Ahab and Jezebel's family. Now, this wasn't some sense of senseless violence. This was God simply carrying out the promise and the curse, because Ahab and Jezebel had led the nation towards idolatry, sexual immorality, and the lack of order for the family. And so God had unleashed his wrath, and he had done that through Jehu, and now he's going to finish off the rest of Ahab's family. It says, on the way, when he was at Beth Eked of the shepherds, Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Now remember, Ahaziah was the nephew of Jehoram, so would have been like the the great nephew, I suppose, of Ahab. And he said, "Who are you?" And they answered, "We are relatives of Ahaziah, and we came down to visit the royal princes and the sons of the queen mother." He said, "Take them alive." And they took them alive and slaughtered them at the pit of Beth Eked, 42 persons, and he spared none of them. So Ahaziah's family is heading to Samaria. They went to visit with some of Ahab and Jezebel's family. Now Ahab was dead. He was long dead, but Jezebel had just been thrown out the window by the two eunuchs. And they want to visit the sons of the queen mother. When Jehu hears that, he's like, yeah, that's enough. Queen mother. They're basically saying that they are loyal to Jezebel, who was wicked. And so Jehu had them killed. I thought that was fascinating. Didn't have time to talk about it, but I thought that was pretty cool. Remember, our big idea is serving God for your own glory leads to loss. Serving God for his glory leads to victory. I want to talk to you about serving in another unique way, and that is simply as an American citizen in America. We're going to talk a little bit about politics, and I want to compare 800 BC to 2026 AD. And you want to say, Chris, why are we talking about politics? And here's why. Okay, I'm not endorsing a candidate here, but I do want to tell you that there are, every year, statistically, we have an election. Every year we have an election. 40 million Bible-believing Christians who do not vote. They do not vote because there's not a candidate holy enough for them, or they don't think that voting makes all the difference. And I'm here to tell you, voting doesn't make all the difference. But not voting fixes nothing. Not voting fixes nothing. We have the opportunity to shape who our leaders might be. We don't get to pick our ideal candidate, but we do get to have a voice in who the candidates will be. There was a pastor in Texas, his name is Josh Howerton, and he described 3 types of political leaders based on scripture. And these 3 leaders happen to be in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so I thought it was fascinating. I wanted to talk to you about this. And it might help you gain some discernment as you vote. You know, 2026 is an election year, and we know 2028 will also be an election year. And so I wanted to take a moment and talk about this. And I also think it might bring some clarity to some of our believers, because we have believers that vote one way, and we have believers that vote another way. And I think there can be a lot of frustration. So I want to give some perspective with that as well. So ultimately, there are 3 types of leaders. There is the Josiah leader, there is the Jezebel Ahab leader, and there is the Jehu leader. The Josiah leader, Josiah is going to show up later in 2 Kings. He becomes a king, a very young king, and he is a godly king. I mean, he throws out all of the pagan idols. He bans all of the sexual immorality. Josiah ends up being a fantastic king because he is a man after God's own heart. And on rare occasions, politically speaking, there are Josiah leaders out there. I don't know that Josiah leaders make it that far when it comes to voting, especially nationally, because unfortunately our nation is not as interested in moral integrity as they are some other things. But that's one type of leader. Another type of leader is the Jehu, or not the Jehu, but the Jezebel and Ahab type of leader. Now, the Jezebel Ahab type of leader are wicked leaders, and we know that God, his wrath burned hot against Ahab and Jezebel, more so than against any other king and queen. And the reason was because not only were they engaged in sexual immorality and idolatry and changing the order of the family, but they spread those dynamics down to their entire kingdom. And so they influenced and they led Israel that way, but they also had a voice in Judah as their family became royalty in Judah. And so their immorality, their idolatry, their way of life infected, like a cancer, infected Israel and infected Judah. And God hated it and he despised it. There are many Jezebel, Ahab type politicians in our country today. And I'm going to say something that you may want to slap me for saying, but I'm just going to tell you it's biblically based. Anytime you see a rainbow flag flying, there is a Jezebel Ahab spirit going on. So keep that in mind. When someone is hugely advocating for gender transition, for any form of sexuality outside of God's design, if anyone is showing preference to other religions and downplaying or condescending toward Christianity, you know that is Jezebel and Ahab's spirit. And then lastly, you've got, and this one's complicated, you've got the Jehu type of leader. A Jehu type of leader is a flawed leader. They likely are not Christian. You wouldn't want them to be your small group leader or your Sunday school teacher, but they might stand by and protect the basic tenets of God's design and his creation for humanity. So a Jehu leader might say, look, men are men and women are women. Let's stop messing around with that. A Jehu leader might say things like, we are going to cater to one religion above another, and we do want Christians to have a legitimate voice. These are the types of things that a Jehu leader might say, but they might not be Christians themselves. Now, people might say, Chris, how could you vote for a Jehu leader? Someone who is harsh, someone who is crass, someone who is prideful, someone who calls people names and seems arrogant. And my answer comes from the way that I am interpreting the Bible. It doesn't come from my emotions. It doesn't come from what I'm seeing on YouTube. It doesn't come from what my friends are saying or what's popular. It's coming from the Bible. Here is a fact that we know from the Bible. It clearly says in Scripture that God is more angered by leaders that spread sexual immorality, that spread gender confusion, and spread pagan idol worship. He is more angered by them than by the people that are harsh, arrogant, name-calling, and prideful. God, his wrath burns hotter towards some sins than others. Now, one of the reasons for that is because the ones that deal with gender, sexuality, and idolatry, they will shape generation after generation. Whereas pride, arrogance, name-calling, some of those things, they can be very deep-seated and wicked, but they can also be changed simply by becoming born again. Some of these other ones, they will seep into generation after generation after generation. And so God's wrath burns hotter towards the sins of Ahab and Jezebel than toward the sins of Jehu. Now we know that Jehu did a lot of the right things for the wrong reasons, but we also know that God's wrath burned hotter against the sins of Ahab and Jezebel. Now, speaking of this idea of idolatry, paganism, sorcery, we talked about Islam last week in the overtime. You know, the largest and most influential city in America, and possibly the most influential city in the world, now has an Islamic mayor. And I believe there are a few other cities, possibly Seattle, that has Islamic mayors. Now, the ironic thing about a mayor who is Muslim in a liberal city is that Muslims don't believe in sexuality outside of marriage. Muslims believe in a man and a woman. Muslims believe in only worshiping one God. It's a different God than we have, but they only believe in worshiping one God. In fact, the most progressive New Yorkers if they moved to a Muslim nation, they would be thrown off the roof and killed. So it's really crazy how the most liberal cities that are the most progressive in sexuality, gender theory, and worshiping many gods and whatever type of God, they have a Muslim mayor. It's ironic. So we might say, well, what do these Muslims, who are very fundamentalist in a lot of ways, what do they and Ahab, Jezebel progressives have in common? I'm here to tell you they have one thing in common. They despise the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is their unifier. And what does the enemy want to do? He wants to take all different beliefs, all different genders, name a gender, all different sexualities, all different orientations. He wants to combine everyone. And then he'll take the fundamentals of every other world religion and he'll say, let's form a giant team, a big tank, and let's hate the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And if we can get enough of these religions together, maybe we can defeat Jesus. Well, we know that's never going to happen because Jesus conquered sin, death, hell, and the grave. And speaking of that, I hope that you've got your plan to invite your friends and your neighbors to Easter weekend at Connect. Of course, watch our Good Friday that's going to stream at 6:30. It's really going to be a cool night of worship. It'll be on demand, available afterward. But then join us on Saturday for our 2 worship services and then on Sunday for our normal 4 worship services. If you can join us Saturday, we're trying to incentivize those that come Saturday. We're going to have a little bit longer worship set. My daughters are going to be singing at least one extra song that it's going to rock. It's going to be awesome. So I hope that you'll join us. I hope not only that, but you will plan to invite your friends and your neighbors. You'll take those invite cards. You'll share out on social media. And we will have our best Easter ever at Connect Church. I am so thankful for you all. I hope that this overtime has helped you in a few ways as we've talked about motives. We've gone a little bit deeper in 2 Kings, but then we've talked a little politics as well. Notice I didn't endorse a candidate. I just gave a biblical rationale for why Christians may vote a certain way. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week.